Hello, everyone. Eddie Smith here from Midwestern Marks. Wanted to hop on and talk about Bolivia real quick. Obviously, the MAS, the Movement for Socialism, won the Bolivian elections in 2020 following the CIA US-backed coup in 2019 that put a fascist right-wing dictatorship in power, ousting Evo Morales, the first indigenous president in Bolivian history, and a socialist president, and replacing him with a far-right Christian anti-indigenous government. So I want to talk about the history of Bolivia. Bolivia has a long history, as most countries in Latin America do, of having neoliberalism implemented on them, right? So in 1985, their president, Victor Paz Estarosa, he was a social democrat, right? So he promised to nationalize a lot of Bolivia's resources. Bolivia has very rich resources, rich in lithium, rich in oil and natural gas. And he said he was going to use those resources to fund social programs, which would help the Bolivian working class. And essentially, a right-wing economist from Harvard or Yale, I can't remember, named Jeffrey Sachs, went over to Bolivia and worked with Estarosa to reduce inflation, which basically meant severe austerity. So cutting all social programs, privatizing everything, allowing tons of foreign capital in to control the Bolivian lithium and the Bolivian natural gas and the Bolivian oil. And Estarosa essentially sold the country out, did exactly what the opposite of what he ran on, which was strengthening social programs, and instead went towards neoliberalism, towards the U.S. economist method. Which was terrible for Bolivia. Of course, they had their unemployment skyrocketed to 30%. Multinationals were extracting tons of wealth out of their country, while at the same time, everyone lived in poverty. So you had huge inequality. The capitalists became extremely wealthy from exporting resources, whereas the working class and those who worked in the Bolivian mines and oil and natural gas industries became extremely poor. Poverty was rampant, hunger was rampant, homelessness was rampant, and unemployment was rampant. And discrimination towards indigenous people was rampant as well. And much of the working class, who was getting paid garbage wages to extract wealth from multinational corporations, were indigenous Bolivian people. So in 2006, Evo Morales wins election democratically. So he wins election for the MAS, the Movimiento al Socialismo, the Movement for Socialism. And he is the first indigenous president in the country's history. So Evo's first step is to renationalize all the gas, oil, and lithium mines, kick all the multinationals out, redistribute huge amounts of land to the indigenous people, especially those who suffered from the legacy of slavery and colonization. And overall, it was great. So statistically, illiteracy was cut, poverty dropped 25%, hunger dropped, extreme poverty dropped 45%. As the Bolivian lithium mines and the oil and natural gas industry were now being used to build schools, to do social programs, to help the working class Bolivians. So Evo, eventually the Supreme Court rules that he can't, of course, there's the U.S. immediately starts trying to intervene, right? The U.S. has wanted Evo out for a very, very long time. And then eventually, Evo has served his terms, and the Supreme Court, he looks to the Supreme Court to allow him to run for more terms, sort of like FDR was a 3-term president in the U.S. Evo wants more terms, and he's extremely popular. He still is the most popular president. He would win election if he ran, if he was allowed to run. So the Supreme Court passes a law saying that he is allowed to run for another term. The U.S. jumps on this and uses it as an opportunity to call Evo an authoritarian dictator who's ruling with an iron fist, suppressing his people, and they use it as justification for regime change. But the CIA was still in the background. There's a People's World article that explains the CIA ties to the Bolivian coup and the FBI ties to the Bolivian coup, training the leaders of the coup. But the CIA still did it covertly. It wasn't a situation like Iraq where we lied the whole country into a war. I would be willing to bet the majority of Americans don't even know that their country has been intervening in Bolivia and actually overthrew the Bolivian democratically elected government and replacing it with a fascist government. If Americans knew that the U.S. was doing that, you wouldn't see so many articles about how Donald Trump is threatening our democracy, right? Because Trump's kind of trying to do a soft coup of his own. And all the liberals are freaking out like, oh, no, our democracy. It's like, yeah, the U.S. doesn't really care about democracy. We just overthrew Bolivia's democratically elected leader. We did try to do a coup of Maduro, who's a democratically elected leader in Venezuela. So anyways, the coup puts Janine Áñez in power. And Janine Áñez is a far-right, theocratic leader. She's really anti-indigenous. She's tweeted and said horrendous, discriminatory things about indigenous people. And as far as economics, she would implement far-right policy, essentially the policy of allowing multinational corporations to extract lithium, oil, and natural gas out of Bolivia rather than nationalizing. So post-coup, Evo leaves to Mexico, and President Alma grants him asylum in Mexico as Áñez takes power, and there's a mass movement against the coup government. So the unions go on strike. The unions of the industries who have been nationalized go on strike, and they lead a movement to bring Evo back. People protest. They get out in the streets. Polling showed that the coup government had something like 13% support of the Bolivian people. And the Bolivian union leaders start preparing for their next election because Bolivia has an election in 2020 and they can vote the coup government out. So on the eve of the election, there's mass voter suppression. So international observers are doxxed and threatened by members of the fascist government. There's reports of kidnapping and military suppression of leaders who are leaders of the MAS who are trying to get out the vote for the MAS candidate Luis Arce, who was a staunch ally of Evo Morales. So in the elections, Luis Arce wins with 55% majority. Despite vast voter suppression, he still dominates the election. It's not even close. The MAS wins again. Luis Arce takes power, and Evo Morales comes back to Bolivia. So a huge win for the international left, honestly. And many socialists are skeptical about whether socialism can be achieved through the ballot box, they think some people think a revolution is the only way to do this. And, many Latin American countries have tried to do it via ballot box, and the CIA has always been able to overthrow them. So here we see that kind of dynamic of Bolivia being in a battle to build socialism via the ballot box. Their people want to do it. The unions want to do it. And the MAS is very strong, but the CIA, hounds them at every turn. And as example of that, days after the election, Luis Arce was attacked with dynamite. So there's already been an attempt on his life, hours after days after he got elected. And also, even more tragically, Orlando Gutierrez, who was one of the union leaders leading the strikes in Bolivia and leading the movement for socialism and the effort to bring Evo back to the country, was beaten to death and killed by a group of far-right fascist thugs. So it just shows the battle that they're fighting in Bolivia right now. And it also shows the importance of the trade unions. The unions have been on the front lines of the movement for socialism. The Bolivian working people want it. The working people are less, they're less like simps. Like in the US, it seems like all working people are simps who worship Donald Trump and anyone who is wealthy. And they just think, I want to be like that someday, rather than, hey, my labor is creating the wealth of the wealthy. Why don't I get a cut of it? US people all just think they're going to be billionaires eventually. And whereas Bolivia recognizes that working people need to organize and fight together, especially when you have this enemy of the imperialist West trying to overthrow your democratically elected leader and implement somebody who's going to give your country's resources away to multinationals. So lots to learn from Bolivia. One of the most interesting stories in the world right now, place where US imperialism has been focused for a long time, and it's going to be really interesting to see what the next move is, because the CIA is pissed. They're mad that Bolivia has a socialist leader back in directly after they did a coup. And many people are saying, the CIA is lacking. They're not going to do anything. But I guarantee you the CIA will be back. They already, we don't know that the CIA tried to kill Arce with dynamite or had the Bolivian trade union leader killed, but the far right is still there in Bolivia. And there's no doubt that the CIA is going to try and work together with them to stop the MAS from moving towards socialism at every turn, because that's what the U.S. empire does. And all they care about is getting Bolivian resources for multinationals. We know this. And it's important to stand with Bolivia and call for hands off Bolivia. Write to Elon Musk. Tell him that lithium is not his. That's another funny part of the story. Elon Musk went on Twitter and said, we will coup whoever we want. Deal with it. Because his smart cars use lithium to build batteries. So he obviously had a vested interest in the Bolivian coup, and his stock shot through the roof directly after the coup happened, because people know that Tesla would, if the far-right government were to have stayed in place, Tesla would have access to cheap lithium. So very interesting. I hate U.S. capitalists, hate multinationals, hate imperialism, stand against imperialism, stand with Bolivia. Vivo la revolucion, vivo Evo, viva Evo, viva Luis Arce, and rest in peace, Orlando Gutierrez, the union leader who was beaten to death. I stand with Bolivia, and I hope you do too.